friends. Welcome. Welcome to those here in the room and also those online. Good to see you. It is our deep and abiding privilege this afternoon to gather on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects today to elders past and present of all the Kulin nations. A particular welcome to any First Nations people gathering with us today. I am aware, as you are, that First Nations people have a tradition of wisdom and spirituality that precedes the one we will be discussing today by tens of thousands of years. And so it is with humility and gratitude that we embark on this conversation today. Welcome to Whitley College. It is my great privilege to welcome David Bebbington. For many of us, walking into a room that David Bebbington is in is like walking into our bibliography or having our bookshelf come to life. I found myself somewhat astonished to learn that Bebbington, David W, is an actual living, breathing person, and it's deeply exciting to be here with him. David, as you know, is a renowned historian of Baptist life, of evangelicalism, and of history of society more broadly, and it is our great privilege to hear from him today. He is in conversation with Reverend Associate Professor Sean Winter. Many of you know Sean joined us late last year at Whitley College as Dean of Research and Director of New Testament Programs. Sean is a wonderful scholar of the New Testament, but I know that deep in his soul, he is a historian of the Baptist movement, and today we are allowing that part of Sean to come to life as it ought to. So will you please join me in welcoming Sean Winter and David Bebbington.
Thank you, friends. It's good to be here, and thank you for making the time to join us for, David, what I hope will be a conversation that will begin with me asking some questions and perhaps interacting with some of your replies. But just to let everybody know, we are planning to leave some time towards the end of the hour for questions from the room here and also from those of you who are online. If you are online and you would like to ask a question, please do that by typing your question into the chat function of the Zoom room, and that will enable us to make sure that we get that question and capture it appropriately. David, it's wonderful that you are here, and we're grateful for you spending the time with us. About 15 years ago, you published a book entitled Baptists Through the Centuries, A History of a Global People, which suggests a kind of historical and geographical span, both going through time and across the globe. And perhaps the conversation today will begin by picking up those two themes, perhaps beginning with the history. I'm going to pick up on something you say at the start of the book. You say that, quote, "The core attributes of Baptists are not simple matters to report," end quote, which those of us who are Baptists would probably immediately recognise as an accurate description. I guess the same thing could be said about any tradition, but when you look at the history of Baptist people, what are the particular reasons, do you think, that explain something of the complexity and the diversity of Baptist people?
Thank you. Can I just offer a preliminary comment of appreciation for being allowed to be here in the first place? I really like coming to Melbourne. I really like coming to this college. I really appreciate being introduced by comparison with a book, which I've never done before. I rather like that. Thank you. Melbourne I love, especially the General Cemetery, which I had a walk around this morning for the third time. So atmospheric, so exciting that I even did a lecture on it last night here in Melbourne. Rather like bringing calls to Newcastle, but nevertheless, it's an exciting place that I find highly inspiring. So, to your question, according to history, what are Baptists about? Well, I'm reminded of a very telling article I read in the periodical Third Way many years ago, which had a monthly article actually, on the theology of Winnie the Pooh. is allocated each week to one denomination and characterised the denomination by one of the figures in the Pooh books. Thus, for example, Pooh himself, a nice cuddly bear, was just like the Church of England. Owl, the learned preacher, was just like the Presbyterian should be. What were the Baptists like? Well, the Baptists were those who were like rabbits and all his friends and relations, i.e. they were enormously diverse, scampering around, not always identifiable readily, wanting to do things, activists, just like rabbits and all his friends and relations. The only denomination that's described as having lots and lots of different types of people in it. And that's what Baptists have been like. Baptists have been various. I think one of the reasons why they've been so various is because of their original trajectory over time. In the 16th century, various groups tried to reform the church. In the 17th century, various groups tried to reform the church further, and Baptists were at the very edge of those who wanted to reform it furthest before you stopped trying to reform it at all. You just became a seeker, giving up the notion there's any chance of reforming the structures. Now, if you constantly want to put the church right, if you're constantly looking for things that need to be corrected, you are very likely to disagree with some of your fellow believers in your church. And that is indeed what happened. For instance, at the start of the 19th century, Robert Hall, one of the greatest preachers, probably the greatest preacher of the age in any denomination, distinguished Baptist, started to say that the way Baptists have treated the Lord's Supper is not right. We've said it's only for those who've been baptized in Jesus. He said we ought to allow anybody who is a sincere believer in Jesus Christ to come to the Lord's table, even if they haven't been baptized as a believer. And he was condemned immediately by some of his contemporaries for abandoning traditional Baptist principles, which were saying that only if you receive the initial sacrament, gospel, being baptized, should you be allowed to participate in the second sacrament, gospel, the Lord's Supper. So the division between open and closed Baptists was a major theme in 19th century church history. It tends to have faded from the history books, because Baptists in the 20th century weren't very pleased about this division and tried to hide it. But it was a crucial issue. Canada, for example, where I've recently been, it actually made people say that those who were in favour of open communion were actually entirely out of fellowship. Just couldn't deal with them beyond the pale. So that open and closed communion, which still takes place to a limited degree in other parts of the world, was absolutely major in the 19th century, because the issue of how far you should reform the church is still current. And of course, the institution that Baptists provide for discussing issues of policy, you can call it the church meeting, which is given other names. In Scotland, it's increasingly called the gathering, which I think is probably for tossing cabers, really, but that's the label being given to our church. The church meeting is where any member is allowed, indeed encouraged, to contribute. And that means that anybody who had any notion about anything would say what they thought, and hence divisions multiply. Hence, it's not just a rabbit, it's like Baptists, all his friends and relations, different views.
That's really helpful, thank you. We might come back to this idea that the quest for reform is linked to and somehow generative of diversity in very significant ways. I think that's a really helpful point. I'm reminded of the General Baptist discussions about whether you were allowed to have a communion service in the morning, because, of course, Scripture was very specific that it's called the Lord's Supper, and therefore you can't have a morning version of communion. And General Baptists would fall out with each other about such niceties. So, I mean, the obvious follow-on question, and again, it's a historical question, is whether looking at that diversity through history, whether there is anything that is kind of coherent or consistent along the path of that history, or indeed across the kind of regions of Baptist diversity. From your own historical work, do you think you can put your finger on something that's core to Baptist identity, or something that's kind of component of Baptist DNA?
I would return to what we talked about a moment, the cult of Baptist DNA. That is the desire to push church reform to its ultimate practice. And I do think that is deeply ingrained in Baptist DNA. That is to say, the imperative of the Reformation, not just to become a Christian, but to ensure that the structure of the church is as God would have it to be, as revealed in the scriptures. I think that is embodied in the DNA of Baptists. Other denominations have taken up a similar. Churches of Christ, for example, assume that with even greater rigor at certain points in the 19th century, and in some cases still do. But nevertheless, the notion that you want to get the structures right, as well as get the individuals right, is there deeply embodied in Baptist life. But simultaneously, and in complementary role to that desire for reformation, has been a desire for revival. Now, that doesn't come in the 17th century estimation. Some Presbyterians are keen on it. They need it. Baptists don't yet in the 17th century. But in the 18th century, the evangelical revival rose in the 1730s. And with the rise of that movement, Wesley and Whitfield and so many others, not necessarily therefore initially associated with this, or initially very suspicious of it, precisely because Wesley and Whitfield were not concerned with getting the church properly informed. That was their worry about it. Nevertheless, they started revival, and especially as revival converts, those who would be converted under Whitfield in particular, enter the Baptist ministry. That revival temper came to mark Baptists too. By the end of the 18th century, most Baptists were very keen on revival as well as reformation. Now, the two are in tension. If you want to get the church structures right, that can be your priority. And in the 19th century, many strict and particular Baptists actually decided that was their priority, so they should retain the old emphasis on reformation. Church must be reformed. And were much less concerned with revival, to the extent they wouldn't even start Sunday schools, because that might be risky, that might bring revival. And they wouldn't even support missionary societies. Well, for a while, eventually they came to accept. So the revival impetus, which is to be identified with the evangelical from the 1730s, became equally entrenched in the global evangelical movement, because it was carried abroad by missions, by the migrations of Baptists too, which is sometimes forgotten. And as a result, Reformation and revival aims were combined in what Baptists were about. Now, that is important for their role relative to other Christians. For example, in Latin America, later 20th century, there were lots and lots of people who were increasingly numerous, increasingly vocal in the societies of that vast continent. No longer was simply a monochrome Roman Catholic area of the world. It was an area where Protestants of various kinds sprang to life. Amongst those Protestants, increasingly during the 20th century, Pentecostals came to be. But Baptists still remained Baptists by and large. There was a group in Brazil who actually imbibed some of the new Pentecostal traits and became Pentecostal Baptists effectively. But the overall pattern of church life in Latin America was transformed. Clearly, the Catholics remained the strongest church in those countries throughout the 20th century. But the Protestants tend to be identified with Pentecostals alone. It began by the very end of the century and into the 21st century to imbibe certain other strange ideas associated with the prosperity gospel, with dominionism, which involved authority descending from above, not up, from the mass of the people the Baptists taught. But Baptists retained their Reformation identity as well as this intensive revival identity, and therefore it was Baptists who commonly led the way in arguing for significant structural components to Christian witness, in politics, for example, in social commitment. They weren't simply concerned to grab their neighbour, bring their neighbour to church and get them to do exciting things, as some Pentecostals were. Not all weddings. The revival and the Reformation DNA were present in these Latin American Baptists. So a person like Escobar produced all sorts of very significant proposals at the Lausanne Conference of Global Evangelicals in 1974, precisely because he wanted to reform practice, not just to spread the gospel, although the two were very much related. The retention, therefore, of the original Reformation identity with the continuance of the revival identity made for a very specific role for Baptists in the Universal Church.
That's a really helpful lens, I think, for even reflecting on contemporary forms of Baptist identity, both at the national, the cultural, or even the local congregational level. To what extent is this a Baptist church that understands some of that Reformation heritage, getting the church and the way authority works, right? Or to what extent is it indebted to traditions of spiritual vitality that perhaps lead them away from some of that self-understanding? That the balance between those two things is a really interesting question.
And that is why it's exceedingly important Baptists should learn and be taught history.
There we go.
Because they must not forget their identity. There must be regular lessons on a man with the potent name of John Smith. John Smith is the person next to the but also Thomas Harris. Leaders of a particular regenerate stream in that Baptist.
Thank you. There is a partly non-verbal amen here. Actually, mentioning Smith and Helwist leads me to maybe ask just a quick supplementary. Where does the activism strand or dimension of Baptist life fit in relation to that structures, spirituality, reform, revival? What generates the sense that Baptists are people who are, I think, very often strongly committed to forms of justice, to forms of social engagement, to political engagement in certain kinds of ways? Does that straddle those two other legs that you established for us?
Activism can mean gospel activism without commitment to socio-political change, at least initially. It might imply socio-political change ultimately. So even in the 17th century, John Bunyan was extraordinarily activist in spreading the gospel, even from prison. A remarkable man who does largely represent the Baptist tradition, although clearly that is a debatable matter. He believed in it. But the impetus to activism undoubtedly increased with the rise of the 1730s. That activism led to a recognition that the gospel must be preached primarily, but that justices at Justitia, was an important principle in this area, as your slogan has it, college, that justice must be done in society too. So that, for example, in the end of the 1780s, when William Wilberforce started leading the campaign for the abolition of the slave trade, Baptists were very prominent, giving up drinking tea. I think that is an admirable quality. I think it should be done on other grounds in our day too. They did it because they didn't want to support the producers of tea, those who sold tea back to the profit loan. They also involved the slave trade. So that socio-political commitment sprang from their gospel perceptions, and the activism was much stronger, I think, from the 18th century onwards. The extent to which Baptists were committed to socio-political reconstruction varied over time. One has to remember that at the end of the 19th century, politics in Britain was divided largely between Anglicans and nonconformists. And Anglicans were overwhelmingly conservative. Nonconformists were overwhelmingly liberal. The Liberals believed in very significant changes. They wanted by that time to abolish not just tea, but also alcohol. They were very good at abolishing, especially drinks.
We haven't discussed this. I was pastor of a church in Reading, which had been founded in 1640. And the post-restoration memory of the life of the church was that Bunyan had visited and preached in the earliest possible period there. So the connection between Bunyan and Baptist life is there in at least one congregation's early memory. But I mean, all of this is, of course, particularly given the conversation between the two of us about familiarity with Baptist life in the UK. And we could discuss other examples, though. I mean, the US is obviously a place where conflict over Baptist identity continues to break out in any number of different ways. Those who are joining us here and online will be able to speak about the experience of diversity and perhaps tension in Baptist life across Australia. Here in Victoria, we have many churches with deep connections to forms of Baptist life in places like Myanmar. If we move just northwest from Myanmar for a moment, in the book, you have this lovely reference to the territory of Nagaland, and you refer to Nagaland as, again, quote, the most Baptist land on earth. And then you say that what has emerged in Nagaland is not just Baptist, but is Naga Baptist. Can you say a bit about what you think makes Naga Baptist and what makes it Naga Baptist, if I can put it that way?
Once at a house group belonging to our own church, I asked that we should pray for Nagaland. And some of my friends in the house group thought that this was a joke, an invented country that didn't exist. Nagaland, ladies and gentlemen, does exist. It is part of the state of India. It's at the extreme northeast corner. It is on the fringe of Assam, which is on the fringe of India. And Nagaland is an extensive territory. In fact, it goes over the border into Myanmar in terms of the people who live there. The Nagas are a traditional people of that part of the world, lived there for many centuries. It's a beautiful part of the world. It has superb, heavily wooded hills rising to the Himalayas. And the Nagas were reached by the Christian gospel in 1871, carried by somebody from Assoc originally, followed up by the American Baptists. The American Baptists settled there with only one or two missionaries initially. And there was very little impact until the very end of the century. But by the First World War, one of the subgroups, the Naga people, have virtually been Christianized, become Baptists in very substantial numbers. But the rest of Nagaland, or a dozen or so subgroups, was very little, in fact, Christianized until after the Second World War. That has a lot to do with the Japanese invasion. Japan actually managed during the Second World War to occupy a bit of India. And the bit of India they occupied was in Naga. Battle of Kohima, which was a turning point when the Japanese advance was repulsed, is at the heart of Nagaland. So what happened after that is that the Naga people felt that the Japanese, who were pretty anti-Christian in their attitudes when they arrived, they speared any Christians they found, led them to ask about what their core values were. Many of them became Christians in large numbers, and the whole of Nagaland was rapidly Christianized. By the end of the century, by around about 2000, roughly 90% of the population of Nagaland professing Baptists, and that is why it is the most Baptist land on earth. Now, there are some unchristian, there's some Catholics, there's some Pentecostals, a few Presbyterians. It's overwhelmingly Christian and Baptist. Now, what is their distinctive character? This goes back to what happened at the end of the Second World War. feeling arose that they wanted to be independent of the British Empire, which they formed a part branch. So they wanted to separate as different. But they wanted to be a separate people from India, because their traditions were entirely distinct. So they actually declared their independence on the day before India declared its independence. And therefore they are confident and they are truly independent to this day and assert that independence. The authorities in Delhi do not like this. Sure. The authorities in Delhi sent in the army and tried to put down what became an insurrection. Certainly after 1956, it was in a state of revolution because the Nagas wanted to be separate, the Indians didn't. 1/5 of the whole Indian army was occupied in that one state. No, it wasn't originally a state, in that area of Nagaland at the start of the 1960s. The way in which that struggle for national independence was formulated by these people becoming so Baptist was that it was an issue between the many gods of India and the one God who was worshipped by the Naga people. So they were conscious that their Christian identity was bound up with their national identity as separate. And they were very much identified with the armed struggle, to the extent that they regularly held armed prayer meetings, which is quite an interesting concept. And that struggle continued on and off, sometimes, interestingly, with Maoist help from across the border in China. Some of the Baptists were very keen on Maoism. They thought it was a very good thing because it was on their side. Sometimes the American Baptists, who still gave a bit of financial support, weren't so keen on a particular proposition. But they developed their campaign and often won battles against the Indian army. Until eventually one of the leaders of the Naga Baptist community decided that it was about time that peace was established. And in 2009, that was done. That was very much a Naga Christian initiative. Since then, there has been a rather tense, almost, in a sense, a suspension of hostilities. There is still a sense of animosity there. Nevertheless, there is what could be called peace. So the Nagas were developing Baptist convictions as their identity in terms of nation. That remains so. The nation that worships one God that is surrounded by a state that worships many gods. That sense of the importance of the Christian faith in shaping every aspect of nationhood is what makes them special, what makes them Naga Baptists.
Which is striking insofar as the British Baptist story emerges precisely in association with critique of the settled nature of the nation state as it's configured in 16th and 17th century England. So you have a very different configuration of political arrangements and convictions and relationship to culture, ethnicity, nationhood, because of those particularly different cultural, historical and political circumstances.
Yes, in the period in the middle of the 17th century, when the New Model Army was defeating the king and Cromwell came to power as Lord Protector, Baptists were very much on the side of political change by revolution. Yeah. So yes, there is a parallel there. However, it has to be seen also that after the restoration of 1660, when the monarchy came back, Baptists kept their heads down.
Absolutely.
Baptists quite kept their heads down in certain circumstances.
And I mean, that question of how a form of ecclesial, or for want of a better word, kind of historical denominational identity, how that plays out in relationship to culture, to geography, to history and political circumstance. It's probably what lies behind my next question, which really relates to, I mean, it's an abstract question at one level, but it's also a question deeply related to Baptist activism in relationship to global mission, for example. It also relates to the diversity of Baptist life that we encounter here in Victoria, for example. I mean, So those of us who come from the very limited kind of cultural assumptions of the West and of the Enlightenment, we know that there is this kind of constant tension between forms of life and practice that appeal to external authority to say what you should do and how you should do it and how you should behave. So Scripture says it, we believe it, that settles it, that kind of appeal to that as the decisive thing. And on the other hand, appeal to human experience, culture, to the particularities of history as a way of determining what kind of church should we be, how should we be living, what should we be doing. And it seems to me that Baptists have always been in negotiation with exactly the tension between those two things. You have in the book a lovely discussion, I think, of E.Y. Mullins in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century, trying to kind of navigate the relationship between experience and scriptural authority in Southern Baptist life in a way that then develops in a particular direction in the history of that community of churches. I mean, we still live in a context where conflicts about the relationship between those two things exist, and many of you will be familiar with them in your own contexts and churches. They play out in related ways, I think, in some of the ways that the culture wars play out in the life of the church. So I guess my question here is, does the history of Baptist ability to deal with those tensions make you pessimistic or optimistic about Baptist capacity to deal with conflict constructively, for example, or to navigate diversity while remaining in some kind of relationship? What happens when we disagree? What does history tell us about how we have handled it or how we might handle it?
Thank you. I agree that tensions have arisen in Western civilization on the lines you describe, but I would also want to say that at the time of the Enlightenment, possibly the Enlightenment, there's a great variety within that, there was a remarkable coincidence between Enlightenment influences, empiricism, utility, promotion of happiness, liberty, and values of that kind. An extraordinary coincidence between them and the evangelical imperative that drove most Baptists. The two actually coincided. So in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, it was wise to regard reason as the lodestar of religion. Baptists did. And to a great extent, they were integrated. Evangelical religion was described as experimental religion, which relates to the scientific dimension of the Enlightenment endeavour. So that tension was for a while largely resolved, which is partly why Baptists, along with other similar convictions, actually made such an impact on society at that time. That's why they done it to a very large extent. However, by the 20th century, there was very much of an unravelling, so that some people began to think that the Bible, as the text stands as we have it, usually in the King James Version, is what must guide us alone. Other people thought we must be guided by developing scientific opinion of our day, which is gathering fresh wisdom. That represents the fundamentalist versus modernist controversy, which afflicts America in a vast way, afflicts Britain a little. It wasn't absent from this country, but from that country. It afflicted Australia, this country, a bit too, especially in Queensland, but so relatively. So the fundamentalist modernist controversy is the classic case where Baptists actually disagreed with each other potently. There were people in America who were swayed by the Chicago School of Theology, which was based on a Baptist institution funded by the Rockefeller family, which promoted the idea that religion should be based on the latest scientific knowledge, really more or less discarded. And people who thought that the Bible was the only source of truth, and in the version they were familiar with, in the tradition that they had received it, they disagreed with each other in a most horrific way, denounced each other, and that was one of the major themes possibly the most major theme in American culture in the 1920s. Now, that is an instance of how Baptists very definitely disagreed with each other more strongly and noisily. They were evangelicals, both sides were evangelicals, they did to an extent. Modernists are more than usually made out. But they were doing what the great American historian George Marsden has defined as being what a fundamentalist is. Fundamentalist, said Marsden, is the evangelical who is angry about something. And that fundamentalism led them to express themselves with real bile. The anger flared out, especially on the fundamentalist side. In some measure on the other side too. So, the great lesson from the fundamentalist controversy, which racked our denomination, probably more than any other, possibly the Presbyterians we see in the 1920s and 30s. But that did not, the lesson from that major controversy, which split the denomination in many ways, is that you should avoid being angry with others if you want to preserve something of your public standing, your acceptability to the public at large, Christian values. If you want to go on actually conversing without denouncing, then you might make progress. I think that is the great lesson for today. Yes, there are issues that go to some fundamentals in many spheres today. Those issues are worth discussing with each other without being nasty to each other. That, I think, is the great lesson. That makes me more optimistic than I otherwise would be.
I'm actually being back connected to this idea that reaching a position that things might need to change, or the way in which we think about or articulate faith might need to be different, might be an ongoing expression of this kind of commitment to the ongoing reform of the life of the church in certain kinds. Like it's built into the question of constantly not adopting a settled arrangement of what the church needs to be or look like, or how it takes up its position in society. But this is always a matter for conversation, or a matter for diverse opinion that then needs to be handled through in the ways that you've just suggested.
The church's method always to reform, but that has to be in tension with the principle that the Bible is always the given revelation of God. So that tension between understanding the world better in the light of what God has created, and knowing what the Bible says and how that applies, and relating the two is the constant ongoing task of the church. I would not want to affirm the need for ongoing reform without stressing the ongoing need to understand the scripture to see how it forms.
Absolutely. I guess the contemporary version of some of those debates plays out across the spectrum of what we would call evangelicalism rather than fundamentalism per se. And of course, you're very well known not only for your work on Baptist history, but also more broadly evangelical history and identity. At the end of your book on Baptists, you say you identify, it was written in 2015, so maybe things have changed. You identify kind of 7 trajectories of contemporary Baptist life that emerge out of this history. But you also state, and again, this is a quotation, that Baptists, quote, turned into evangelicals and remain overwhelmingly so. Much of your work has been about what that term evangelical connotes, the famous Bebbington quadrilateral, which you can remind us of, those of us who haven't been taught it. But I guess my question is, these things never remain static. Evangelical identity isn't static. Baptist engagement with that evangelical identity doesn't remain static. Do you have thoughts about what evangelicalism is becoming and what that might mean for the way that Baptists think about themselves as evangelicals?
Let me start with the evangelical quadrilateral. Let's call it the evangelical quadrilateral, not attaching the name of the individual. Much prefers us to do that. This was suggested at the start of a book I wrote on evangelicalism in Britain as the view that everybody held. I was simply reporting the consensus expectation. What evangelicals were those who emphasised, not just upheld, but emphasised Bible, cross, that is the doctrine of the atonement, conversion, the need for lives to be changed, activism, evangelism, and indeed social commitment. That's the quadrilateral, the 4 points. When I published a second edition of the book, which was actually in 2018, I saw no reason, the Baptist book, I saw no reason to change my estimate there that Baptists were evangelical by that criteriology. Overwhelmingly so. Not entirely so, because there are strands in Baptist life which would not wish to identify those 4 emphases over and above other emphases. They're relatively few. There is one church I've been taken to here in South Melbourne, which I believe wants to stress important matters of Greek Orthodox practice, faith and practice, alongside these, and I think that would be an exception, rather exceptional many times. Well, how is that evangelical identity changing? It seems to me that the way in which the Bible is understood is changing, and that evangelicals have come to accept that biblical criticism is a legitimate, indeed desirable practice, so long as done conscientiously. That would not have been so amongst evangelicals uniformly in the early 20th century. Big change. Doctrine of the cross, I think most evangelicals will probably now want to say that many understandings of the cross can be used to explicate biblical witness, whereas in the past, some would have said that only one model should. And that model is to do, well, we can go into detail. On conversion, I think some evangelicals in the past would have said that some conversion is essential. Well, I think very few evangelicals that. Indeed, over time, a lot of evangelicals have not held that even time. Some especially popular with Methodists. Methodists were breaking myself. And the extent to which activism has changed is marked in the later 20th and early 21st century, in that up to the 1960s, it was common for Baptists to say, especially more conservative Baptists, but it was very common to say, the only legitimate activism is gospel. But, led by the Latin Americans I referred to before, the conviction spread that gospel work must be complemented by socio-political action. That is an expression of the gospel just as much as spreading the gospel. And that is a major change. So on all these 4 points, yes, there has been change. Sometimes some people would say it's gone too far. Sometimes some people say it's not gone far enough. That's exactly what one would expect. And it has therefore been change. That change has been, in the evangelical broadly, has been reflected in the Baptist life. However, I have recently been one of the co-editors of the new Oxford Handbook of Baptist Studies, which with 3 other colleagues are going to produce, where all the contributors get round to handing their essays. And this volume will, all being well, appear next year. I've been responsible for the historical section. And it is very striking that the sections on the newer churches, parts of the world where the newer Baptist churches have flourished, that their emphasis is overwhelmingly evangelical under this criteriology. You don't find many churches in, say, Korea, South Korea, taking any other line, and conscious of being part of a kind of evangelical movement with particular emphases, with the legacies of the Reformation, making distinctive evangelical. Nevertheless, they, for example, send out vast numbers of missionaries. And that is part of this. So I do think that I want to stand by that quotation, and I do want to agree with you. Evangelicalism changes over time.
Thank you. Thank you for engaging so constructively with the questions that I've been asking. I'm conscious that we have some time, about 15 minutes for questions from those who have joined us. Maybe we'll begin by asking if anyone in the room has a burning question that they would like to ask, in which case we'll go to the room First of all, I'm going to ask you to make your questions as brief as possible and not to turn them into speeches. So yes, I'll be back here, please. Just speak as loudly as you can. I'll repeat the question if I need to.
Hi, David. I'm Stephen. I'm here in Victoria. I'm interested in your thoughts on Naga's self-understanding of the national and ethnic identity intertwined with the Baptist identity. Now, as far as I understand it, one of the tenets of Baptist identity is separation of church and state. So how would the Naga Baptists see that having a nationhood that is distinctive to the Baptist, but not exercising the powers of the state to enforce it, or as Baptist believe?
It is often said, yes, that a Baptist principle is the separation of church and state. That is a formulation of Baptist opinion which has had most circulation in the United States of America, where that has become embodied in the Constitution in a big way, which does not, of course, prevent the impact of religion on politics or the reverse process. I think that is a slightly too dogmatic formulation of Baptist principle. Baptists have consistently over time been in favour of religious liberty. Thomas Ellis was in favour of that as early as the start of Baptist life, beginning of the 17th century. And that is to say that the king should not interfere in matters of religion. It's not part of the province. But Ellis was not really erecting the boundary between church and state in the sense in which both church and state were to develop by the time of the American Revolution. So I would want to say that the Baptist principle is religious liberty rather than separation of church and state. If I were in America at this point, I'd be showered by brickbats. I'm not, however. I'm in another country, so I venture to say that.
Thank you. Is there a question online, Dan?
None at the moment.
None at the moment. Okay. And then we'll go to Katrina.
David, can you offer any observations about particular patterns of reform that Baptists have engaged with historically? How do we do that when we do it?
And in the process, what happens?
Okay. Let's start with reforming society rather than church. Now, that is the sense then of Baptists primary concern with church. If you're concerned with socio-political change, then Baptists have characteristically had two approaches. One is to promote a mass movement. That is to say, to encourage lots of people to petition whatever the legislature is, to go and go round door to door, knocking out supporters, repel badges in people in the street, and so on and so forth. That has been a major aspect of their activity. The other activity has been to choose individuals who are skilled at the political process to provide leadership. And that is not necessarily antithetical to the other, the two can combine. It has been very evident, for example, the case I gave earlier, of the support that Baptists very generally Wilberforce campaigns against first the slave trade and slavery. He was a masterly figure who was actually a politician before he was a Christian, by his own estimation. He was converted within a couple of years of entering Parliament. But he was a leader to whom the Baptists looked for leadership, and successfully. There is a very serious danger, it seems to me, in the largely populist mass movement approach, is that can become rather fanatical and single-minded and exclude concern with other issues, and therefore needs to be moderated, in my view, by choosing a political leader of skill, or a certain leader of social skill. Like, in my view, William Ewart Gladstone, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the second half of the 19th century on 4 occasions, Baptists followed almost to a man. We couldn't actually vote for him. And I think that mass movement dimension needs to be moderated by the very carefully chosen and not skillfully. So that's society. On the church, the extent to which Baptists have tried to reform the church has been immense and varied. Sometimes a minister in a church has said, we'll do things a different way, and the church tends to follow in order. Usually that happens in the first year of history, not in subsequent years of experience. Ministers find it much harder to change things when people are not used to them. But it can be through movement in the church meeting, and the best type of church reform, or if you will, decision on church policy, can often be from a voice within the church meeting that actually vocalises a particular point of view, then other people are persuaded of. Let me give you a concrete instance. At St Andrew's Baptist Church down the road from us, about 8 years ago, they needed a new minister, and the new minister had to be chosen out of a range of types of person. And one candidate came forward who was actually from Congo roots. And people with suspicion about that, was he sufficiently familiar with Scottish and so on and so forth. But then a teenager got up and said, he's just the man we want. And his enthusiasm spread to others. They did choose that minister. He's had a hugely successful ministry. And that is where, from below, change, and admittedly it's not drastic change, it is a change in ministry and has led on to change in what the church does. And I think that that's an admirable phenomenon, which vindicates the way in which Baptists do things, should do things, and is admirable, should be imitated.
Thank you. Titus, I think. Titus.
Thanks, David, for your presentation. You alluded briefly to the influence of Pentecostalism, briefly, especially in Latin America. And across the world today, there is this trend of Pentecostalization of global Christian identity, which some have referred to as a negative influence rather than positive by every standard. I wanted to ask, what's your thought about the influence of Pentecostalism on global identity of Baptists? Would you estimate that to be positive or negative? The second question is, how do you think we can preserve Baptist distinctiveness in face of this Pentecostal influence all around? And this is happening in different ways. Here, for example, in Victoria, you have some churches who still put to hymn singing because they believe hymns are very rich in theology and they stimulate faith and things like that. Whereas you have other churches who have gradually moved away from that, and all they do now is just sing Eastern songs, better songs, and so on. What are your thoughts?
Okay, on the first issue, I would want to distinguish sharply between classic Pentecostalism and charismatic renewal. Classic Pentecostalism was very denominationally minded and believed in structure, and that had something in common with Baptist emphasis on Reformation. Charismatic renewal, which springs to life in the 1960s, or it has deeper roots in the previous 2 decades. Charismatic renewal did not, and was all about self-expression. To a very large extent, is indebted to the predominant cultural influence of the late 20th century, which remains predominant into the early 21st century, which I would call expressivism, which means that you have to express your feelings from within. That's indebted to major cultural influences from the start of the 20th century. So that, for example, the most characteristic feature of charismatic renewal in its early days is waving bands. That is expressing what is in the heart, at least in theory. Now, that may be, what that means is that a phenomenon that I now see as affecting the church more broadly, like in the from the late 20th century, but strongly in the early 21st century, is more to do with charismatic renewal, unstructured, with the classic Pentecostalism. Now that charismatic renewal has enormous virtues, vitality, recognising that heart religion is absolutely crucial, or else there's no point in Christianity at all. And vital expression of its faith is in measure a good thing. However, it is, I fear, subject to certain influences which appear to be endemic within that style of religion, which involve authority descending from above to below. And that is very much contrary to the Baptist understanding of church. And I would want to argue that as a result is not what the New Testament is about. It is not about descending authority. It's about authority rising from the whole people of God. So good vitality, bad authoritarianism, which is often called dominionism in contemporary thought, but that's a specific formulation of it, but enormously influential in many parts of the world. True. On the second issue, how to preserve Baptist distinctives? Well, I can give you a case study. In Nigeria, which you maybe know a bit about, there was a major movement at the start of the 20th century to appoint authoritarian leaders, because look, the Redeemed Christian Church of God, that has made huge progress since 1952. We want to get as many members as they do. So let's change our structures, let's have authoritarian leaders, and let's do away with church meeting and let authority descend. Happily, there were some Nigerian Baptists who read history, and therefore they were aware that that is not what Baptists are fundamentally about. And they resisted this movement. Now, sometimes I think they made mistakes. They resisted expressions of vitality, which I think was a thoroughly bad thing, such as all-night prayer meetings, which I think in moderation or a step for encouraging spiritual activity in moderation. But they resisted the doing away with these traditional structures of Baptist life, which have their sanction in the New Testament. Now, I don't think there's any reason why church meetings shouldn't decide some days to have hymns and sometimes to have popular songs for the day. It's up to church meeting. That's the thing that I think needs to be preserved.
I'm going to take Glenn first of all, and then finally the principal who will ask the final question. So, Mark.
Thanks very much, David. This is my third Bebbington event in 4 days. And I'm not even a Baptist. You may have been informed on this visit that a number of congregations have been essentially evicted from the New South Wales Baptist Union because they took an affirming stance for people with diverse sexuality, which seemed to be contrary to Baptist principles. I wonder if that has played out similarly in the United Kingdom, whether there are any lessons to be learned, anything salutary from a similar experience, if any, in the UK.
My understanding of this complex issue is that it has lasted in New South Wales for about 6 years, and that the issue ultimately came down to the interpretation of something like standing orders in the association. So it may not have been actually on the issue of affirming per se, but on the interpretation of regulations relating to some sort of statement made in 2012, as I understand it, which talked about what marriage was. But you will know far more. I'm simply going to say whether the issue was should simply be formulated as a matter of liberty for churches. I'm not so sure. I think it may have become entangled in legalistic concerns. But you asked about it. Yes, there was a major issue a year ago when the Baptist Union Council discussed whether or not people in gay unions could legitimately be recognised ministers on the accredited list. That was the suggestion they could be was rejected by a very substantial majority. That is now the standard view. Some people were very unhappy about that because it was felt to be a decision which did limit the liberty of churches to have something on the accredited list they wanted. However, I do not know how it has worked out in its practical application since, because I'm a member of a church which owes its immediate allegiance to Baptist Union Scotland. Well, that's affiliated to Baptist Union Great Britain. Nevertheless, it's the Baptist Union Scotland I hear about. And there, interestingly, there is only, I think, one church out of 160 which would wish to sympathise with the affirming side. Therefore, my vision of what's going on is very limited here. In terms of lessons, I would return to the one I mentioned earlier. This is a very divisive issue, links to contemporary social change at a very fundamental level. It's not surprising it does cause division. Now, I want to go back to the point that is, issues such as this need to be discussed without rancor, that there should not be name calling, there should not be attribution of false motives, such as a dismissal of the Bible and so on, when those are not really what the motives are. So I would ask that Baptists in New South Wales, possibly Victoria too, nice to meet you.
Thank you, Glenn. You and I can talk after, but other things to be said. Darryl.
Thank you, David. And if I can just acknowledge that Belinda Groves, pastor of Canberra Baptist, has popped a comment in the chat bar. One of those churches that was evicted with 2/3 majority. Oops, just by acknowledging that. However, my question addresses another area of difference, if not fracture, which relates to my experience as a migrant in Australia, having first arrived in New South Wales and then in Victoria, where the two states differ on the provision and the involvement of Baptists in education, particularly where it involves receipt of state monies to support the substantial fees that are often paid to these Baptist schools. I wonder if you have any reflection on what you, if you have reflected on the matter, what you feel might be some of the issues at the heart of that different approach to should Baptists deliver, particularly secondary education, sometimes tertiary, or not.
Before this meeting, we were having a discussion about Hungary. And the Baptist Union of Hungary, about 20 years ago, accepted a government initiative to take on a sector of state education, not receiving funding for it purely, simply, actually doing all the organisation, running the schools, being the state provider, as it were, as the agent of the state, perfectly happy. I'm not prepared to say that that was wrong. Okay, you could say that that's a compromise with the state, it is, but I would not absolutise the separation of church and state, some of our very good friends in denomination do. And therefore I would say that that is an option, but it is an option like marriage, not to be enterprised lightly. It is a very risky measure because sooner or later, the state will want some things to be taught, and Baptists will not want to teach it. And at that point, there will be conflict, and I'm sure that that will be the outcome. However, in the meanwhile, a lot of children are being well taught by able teachers who have Christian motivation, a Christian worldview, and that will be transmitted to some of them to their spiritual welfare. Really like that. So I'm not prepared to say that Hungarian friends are wrong. I think I mentioned to you that at the meetings of which this was part, friend from Germany was prepared to say that Hungarian are absolutely wrong. They're entirely dismissive of Baptist principle. He said so with force, guttural vigour. But I don't agree.
Friends, our time is up. Thank you for your engagement and for those further questions. But particularly, David, thank you for your presence here and for your engaging with the questions and in this conversation. I think in your responses, in the way that you've handled the conversation, you've done Many of the things that we recognise when we read your work in your books, you've explored and explained things with considerable clarity, and also in a way that keeps an eye on the complex relationship between faithfulness to a tradition, an understanding of historical change, the nature of contemporary challenges, and the quest for an undergirding sense of what the church is and what spiritual vitality is to be. For us, I think, for our students here at Whitley, for the Whitley community more broadly, that models not only what Christian scholarship is about, but also what Christian discipleship should look like. And so we're enormously grateful for you spending an hour modelling that for us in this conversation. Friends, thank you for being here. Those of you who are in the room, there's now opportunity for refreshments. To those of you who are online, we're grateful for your presence. Would you all please join me in thanking Professor David?
I think before one of my colleagues formally closes, if I can in a very concrete manner, express our appreciation to David Bebbington for his time with us today. I'm told that it's very difficult to find a book that isn't already in his collection, but I believe we have managed to identify at least two that I hope you will enjoy reading, and also a small card saying thank you. And we're really grateful for the time you spent with us, and we wish you God's blessing as you continue your journey.
Thank you very much. But these are books I will like. They are, and I will. Thank you.
Friends, please enjoy some hospitality and conversation as we finish up formally here. To our friends online, au revoir. I look forward to some conversation with some of you in our Baptist Identity class next week.
Uh-huh.
Good evening.